Please help my mom. Daniel Carter had just opened the front door when he heard them. Cold air slipped into the warm foyer behind him as he looked down at the child on his steps. Daniel rested one hand against the doorframe. "Hey there," he said cautiously. "Where did you come from?" The girl pointed down the quiet street behind her. "From my house. It's 2 streets that way." Daniel glanced toward the empty road. Maple Street was completely still. Most of the houses had gone dark hours ago. Only the soft glow of his own porch light stretched across the driveway. "What's your name?" he asked. "Annie." "Well, Annie," Daniel said, keeping his voice calm. "It's pretty late for someone your age to be outside." She nodded slightly. "My mom needs help." Daniel sighed quietly. "Have you called 911? "Yes." "And?" "They said the ambulance is busy tonight." Daniel looked at her more carefully now. She didn't seem frantic, just determined. Still, the situation made him uneasy. A child showing up alone at midnight on the porch of a billionaire's home was not exactly a normal Tuesday night. "Where's your house again?" he asked. "Oak Lane." Daniel knew the area, older houses, working families. Not far, but far enough for a child to walk alone in the cold. He crossed his arms lightly. "Annie," he said gently, "the best thing you can do right now is go back home and wait for the ambulance. They'll get there." "My mom fell in the kitchen," Annie said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Right, and the ambulance will take care of that." The girl didn't move. Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said kindly but firmly, "but I'm not really the person you should be asking. Medical emergencies need professionals." He gave her a polite, reassuring smile. "You should head back home now, okay?" Then he gently closed the door. Inside, the house fell quiet again. Daniel stood there for a moment in the foyer. The warmth of the house quickly returned once the cold air disappeared. He exhaled slowly. Probably just exhaustion, he told himself. Parents faint sometimes. Ambulances handle this sort of thing all the time. He walked a few steps toward the kitchen. Then came the sound. Knock. 3 small taps against the front door. Daniel stopped. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but the knocking came again. Knock, knock. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck and walked back toward the door. He opened it halfway. Annie was still there. She hadn't moved from the porch. "Annie," he said, a little surprised. "I told you the ambulance. Please help my mom." Her voice remained calm, but the words came quicker this time. "She won't wake up." Daniel frowned. "I understand that. But I knocked on the other houses," Annie said. Daniel paused. They didn't open. The street behind her was still empty. Dark houses, closed curtains, no lights, only his. Annie looked back at him. "Your house was the only one awake." Daniel followed her gaze instinctively toward the glowing windows behind him. He had left nearly every light on again tonight, a habit he had never thought much about. But from the street, the house must have looked like a lighthouse. He looked back down at Annie. "You walked here by yourself?" he asked. "Yes." "In the dark?" "Yes." "How far is your house?" 5 minutes. Daniel considered the situation. Closing the door again would be the logical choice. Call 911 himself. Let emergency services handle it. But Annie remained standing there as if she had already exhausted every other option. The wind picked up slightly, brushing across the stone steps. Daniel noticed something then. Her hands were folded together tightly in front of her hoodie sleeves, as if she were trying to stay warm. That quiet determination unsettled him more than panic would have. "Daniel Sehil, is she breathing?" he asked. "Yes." "Is she awake?" "No." He ran a hand through his hair. "You said Oak Lane?" "Yes." Daniel glanced once more down Maple Street. The neighborhood slept. Every door closed. Every light dark, except his. He looked back at Annie. "All right," he said finally. Daniel stepped back inside just long enough to grab his coat from the rack beside the door. He slipped it on and reached for his car keys from the table. Then he stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind him. "Show me where your house is," he said. Annie nodded. She turned and began walking down the sidewalk. Daniel followed a few steps behind. "Wait," Daniel said. Annie stopped and looked back. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his car keys. The quiet jingle of metal broke the stillness of the night. "We're not walking," he said. "That'll take too long." Annie nodded once, as if that solution made perfect sense. Daniel stepped off the porch and pressed the unlock button on his key fob. A black SUV parked in the driveway blinked its lights and gave a soft electronic chirp. Daniel opened the passenger door. "Go ahead," he said. Annie climbed in without hesitation. Her boots left small specks of frost on the floor mat as she settled into the seat. Daniel closed the door, walked around the front of the car, and got in behind the wheel. The engine started with a low, steady hum. Warm air began flowing from the vents almost immediately. Daniel glanced at Annie while pulling his seatbelt across his chest. Which way? Annie pointed through the windshield. Down Maple Street, then left. Daniel eased the SUV out of the driveway. They drove slowly at first. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel while the other rested lightly near the gear shift. You said your house is on Oak Lane? He asked. Yes. How far? 2 streets. Daniel nodded. All right. The tires rolled quietly along the pavement. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The dashboard clock read 12:04 a.m. Daniel glanced sideways at Annie again. She sat upright in the seat, her hands folded together in her lap. Her hoodie sleeves hung past her fingers, and the oversized boots she wore barely reached the edge of the seat. Daniel had met many adults who handled emergencies worse than this. You said your mom fell in the kitchen? He asked. Yes. Did she say anything before that? She said she felt dizzy. Daniel turned left at the next corner. The houses began to change. Maple Street's larger homes gave way to smaller properties with narrow driveways and older siding. Some porches had chairs stacked against the walls, and several yards showed patches of winter grass where the frost had settled. A streetlight flickered above the intersection. Daniel slowed slightly. What does your mom do for work? He asked. She works nights. Where? A warehouse. Daniel nodded again. The distribution center outside town employed hundreds of workers on rotating night shifts. He knew the place. Long hours, heavy lifting, little rest. Did she eat tonight? He asked. Annie thought about it. I think she forgot. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose. That explained more than Annie probably realized. Exhaustion could shut a person down quickly if the body had been pushed too far. Which house? Daniel asked as they turned onto Oak Lane. Annie pointed ahead. The one with the small porch. Daniel slowed the SUV. The house sat halfway down the block. A modest one-story home with pale siding and a narrow front porch supported by 2 thin wooden posts. The porch light was still on. Daniel pulled the SUV up beside the curb and turned off the engine. All right, he said. They stepped out together. The air felt colder here than it had on Maple Street. Annie hurried up the walkway and pushed the front door open. Mom? Daniel followed her inside. The living room was small but clean. A couch sat against one wall with a folded blanket draped across the back. A child's coloring book lay open on the coffee table beside a handful of crayons. The faint smell of detergent hung in the air. Annie moved quickly toward the kitchen. She's in here. Daniel stepped into the doorway behind her. The kitchen light buzzed softly overhead. A glass lay shattered across the tile floor, and beside the counter, a woman lay motionless on the ground. Daniel crossed the room immediately. Okay, let's see, he murmured. He crouched beside her and gently placed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. Pulse. Weak, but present. She's breathing, Daniel said. Annie stood quietly near the doorway. I told you. Daniel studied the woman more closely. Her skin looked pale and damp, and strands of dark hair clung to her forehead. The exhaustion in her face was unmistakable. Did she hit her head when she fell? He asked. I don't think so. Daniel carefully shifted her onto her back to make breathing easier. Good, he said quietly. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. The operator answered quickly. This is Daniel Carter, he said calmly. I'm at a residence on Oak Lane. Adult female unconscious but breathing. Likely severe exhaustion or dehydration. The operator asked a series of questions. Daniel answered each one while watching the woman's breathing. Yes. Pulse present. Yes. Airway clear. Yes, we're inside. The operator confirmed an ambulance was already being redirected toward the address. Daniel ended the call. They're on the way, he said. Annie nodded once. Daniel glanced around the kitchen. A lunchbox sat on the counter beside a pair of worn work gloves. Several unopened envelopes rested near the refrigerator door. He had seen this pattern before. Long shifts, bills stacking up, people pushing themselves past the point where their bodies could keep up. Daniel looked back down at the woman on the floor. Something about her face seemed familiar. He leaned closer. The shape of her jaw, the arch of her eyebrows. A faint memory tugged somewhere deep in his mind. He frowned slightly. Annie, he said slowly. What's your mom's name again? Laura. Laura what? Laura Mitchell. Daniel went very still. The name struck him like a sudden echo from another life. If this moment touched your heart, take a second to like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Your support helps this story reach more people. And if you enjoy powerful stories about kindness, justice, and unexpected connections, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. Laura Mitchell. He looked down at the woman again. A classroom, fluorescent lights, rows of desks, and a girl who once sat 2 seats ahead of him in high school. Daniel exhaled quietly. "Laura," he murmured under his breath. In the distance, faint sirens began to grow louder as the ambulance approached Oak Lane. Laura Mitchell. The name did not belong in that kitchen. It belonged somewhere else entirely under buzzing fluorescent lights, in a brick high school with waxed hallways and old lockers. In a time before Daniel Carter had learned how quickly a person could leave a town and become a stranger to it, he stared at the woman on the floor a second longer than he should have. 20 years had changed her face, as time changed everyone's, but not enough to erase the outline of the girl he remembered. Not enough to hide the familiar set of her mouth or the quiet strength in her features. Even now, worn thin by exhaustion. "Mr. Carter?" Annie's voice pulled him back. Daniel blinked and looked up at her. "It's okay," he said, rising to his feet. "The ambulance is coming." He moved automatically after that, not because he felt calm, but because motion was easier than memory. He grabbed a dish towel from the counter and swept the broken glass farther back toward the wall so Annie wouldn't step on it. Then he checked Laura's breathing again. Still shallow, still steady. Annie stood near the kitchen doorway, watching him with the same composed focus she had shown on the porch. Daniel glanced toward a cabinet. "Do you have a blanket?" "In the living room." He nodded. "Bring me the one on the couch." Annie disappeared and returned a moment later with a faded navy blanket folded carefully over both arms. Daniel took it and draped it lightly over Laura's legs and torso. "She's cold," Annie said. "She's worn out," Daniel replied. "This will help a little." He heard the siren before the red lights flashed across the front window. A moment later, 2 paramedics entered the house carrying equipment bags, followed by an EMT wheeling in a stretcher. "Adult female, unconscious but breathing," Daniel said immediately. "Possible severe exhaustion and dehydration." She collapsed in the kitchen. One of the paramedics knelt beside Laura while the other began attaching a blood pressure cuff and pulse monitor. Their movements were quick, practiced, efficient. Annie stepped aside without being asked. The older paramedic glanced at Daniel. "You family?" Daniel hesitated. "No. I brought her daughter home and found her like this." The man nodded, uninterested in the details as long as the facts were clear. Laura stirred faintly when they rolled her onto the stretcher, but her eyes did not open. Her breathing caught once, then steadied again under the oxygen mask they placed over her face. Annie moved closer. "Can I come?" The younger EMT looked at Daniel, perhaps because he was the adult standing nearest. Perhaps because Annie had arrived with him, and not alone. Daniel answered before he had time to question it. "Yes," he said. "She's coming." The EMT nodded. "One can ride up front." Daniel turned to Annie. "You'll ride with them. I'll follow behind." "Okay." That one word carried more trust than Daniel felt he deserved. He watched as the paramedics wheeled Laura out of the house. Annie walked beside the stretcher, not reaching for it, not asking more questions, simply staying close enough to see her mother's face. Daniel stood in the kitchen for half a breath after they left. The room was suddenly quiet again except for the refrigerator hum and the faint ticking of a cheap wall clock above the stove. Laura Mitchell. He looked around at the small signs of her life. A child's lunch packed for morning. A stack of overdue envelopes near the fruit bowl, a pair of work gloves worn nearly smooth at the fingertips. He remembered another version of Laura, 17, bright-eyed, always carrying 2 books when everyone else carried one. She had been the kind of person teachers trusted, and weaker kids found themselves standing beside at lunch without ever being asked why. Daniel shook off the memory and followed the EMTs outside. The ambulance doors shut with a hard metallic thump. Red lights pulsed across Oak Lane, flashing against quiet porches and parked cars. Annie climbed into the front passenger seat with the EMT. One of the paramedics gave Daniel the hospital name and a quick nod before the ambulance pulled away. Daniel stood beside his SUV for a second, cold air pressing at his coat. Then he got in and drove. The hospital sat on the far side of town, small and functional, the kind of place people relied on more than they praised. By the time Daniel arrived, the ambulance was already backed into the emergency bay. Inside, the waiting room looked exactly the way small-town emergency rooms always looked after midnight. Tired, overlit, and full of people pretending not to look at one another. A television mounted in the corner played a muted late-night news segment no one was watching. A vending machine buzzed beside a row of plastic chairs. Annie sat in one of those chairs with both feet tucked back beneath the seat. A nurse at the intake desk looked up as Daniel approached. "She's with me," he said, then corrected himself. I brought her here." The nurse, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses hanging from a chain, studied him, then Annie, then the expensive coat Daniel had forgotten he was still wearing. "You the emergency contact?" Annie answered first. "I'm her daughter." The nurse softened immediately. "Of course you are, honey." She slid a clipboard toward Daniel. "If you know the mother's full name and address, fill out what you can. We'll sort out the rest later." Daniel took the clipboard and sat beside Annie. The paper felt strangely small in his hands. Patient name, Laura Mitchell. Address, 18 Oak Lane. He stopped there for a moment. "Do you know your mom's birthday?" he asked quietly. Annie told him. He wrote it down. Insurance provider. He left that blank. Employer. Warehouse, Annie said. "Do you know which one?" She named the distribution center. Daniel nodded and filled it in. He handed the clipboard back to the nurse, who glanced over it and offered a small, tired smile. "Doctor will come speak to you when they know more." Daniel sat down again. For a while, neither of them spoke. The automatic doors opened and closed every few minutes, letting in short bursts of cold air and the distant crackle of ambulance radios. Somewhere behind the double doors marked staff only. Carts rolled across tile floors and voices moved in low, efficient tones. Annie looked down at her boots. "I didn't know if you were going to come," she said. Daniel turned slightly. "From the house?" She nodded. He let out a breath through his nose. "Honestly," he said, "I didn't know either." That seemed to make sense to her. She looked at the coffee machine across the waiting room, then back at him. "My mom says some people got big houses because life was kind to them. But she says what matters is what they do with the front door." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "That sounds like your mom." Annie nodded. "She says a lot of things like that." The nurse called Annie's name then, not because there was paperwork for a 6-year-old, but because she had found a small juice box and a package of crackers behind the desk. "Come here, sweetheart." Annie looked at Daniel before standing. He gave a slight nod. "Go ahead." She returned a minute later, carrying both items carefully, as if they were more valuable than they really were. She sat back down and handed him the crackers first. Daniel blinked. "Those are for you." "I know," Annie said. He almost smiled. "You can keep them." She did, opening the package with determined fingers. A doctor finally stepped through the double doors at 12:51 a.m. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with the deliberate expression of a man used to delivering hard truths clearly. "Family for Laura Mitchell?" Daniel rose. Annie stood with him. "I'm Daniel Carter. This is her daughter Annie." The doctor nodded once. "Miss Mitchell is stable. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, and dangerously low blood pressure. She appears to have pushed herself too hard for too long." Annie looked up. "Is she awake?" "Not yet. But I expect she will be." The little girl absorbed that quietly. Daniel asked the next question before he could stop himself. "Was it close?" The doctor glanced at him, understanding more than the words themselves. "Yes," he said. Another few hours alone at home might have ended differently. The sentence settled heavily in the space between them. Daniel thought of the door. The first refusal, the latch turning shut beneath his hand. He looked across the waiting room windows where the reflection of the fluorescent lights washed out the dark beyond. Money can build walls, he thought, but walls had a way of making a man smaller inside them. The doctor was still speaking, explaining observation, fluids, rest, possible discharge in a day or two, if Laura responded well. Daniel heard the words, but only part of him stayed with them. Another part had gone backward in time to a high school hallway, to a girl with a stack of textbooks and a voice that once told a younger, awkward version of him, "You don't have to act like being alone doesn't bother you." He had not seen Laura Mitchell since graduation, and now he was sitting in a hospital waiting room at midnight beside her daughter. Life, Daniel thought, had a strange habit of returning unfinished things. When Daniel returned to the waiting room, the clock above the television read 1:18 a.m. The late-night news had given way to an infomercial no one was watching. A man in work boots slept with his arms crossed over his chest in the far corner. An elderly woman sat beneath a pale blue blanket, her daughter rubbing slow circles over her shoulder. The coffee machine near the vending machines gave off the faint, burnt smell of coffee that had been sitting too long. Annie was still in the same chair. She had finished the juice box and crackers. The empty carton sat neatly folded on the seat beside her, her feet no longer tucked beneath the chair. She sat with her hands resting in her lap, looking toward the double doors each time they opened. Daniel sat down again. "The doctor says your mom's stable," he told her, though she had already heard. Annie nodded once. He said she pushed herself too hard. There was no blame in the child's voice, only the careful repetition of an adult sentence she was trying to understand. Daniel leaned back in the plastic chair and looked around the room. Hospitals at night had their own kind of silence. Not true silence, there were too many sounds for that. Phones ringing at desks, wheels passing over tile, doors opening, shoes squeaking, monitors chiming in distant rooms. But beneath all of it lived a shared understanding. No one was there because the day had gone according to plan. Annie looked up at him. "Are you going home?" The question was simple. Still, it held him for a second. "No," Daniel said. "Not yet." She seemed satisfied with that answer. A nurse approached from the desk holding a small folded blanket the hospital kept for pediatric visitors. She handed it to Annie with the tired kindness of someone who had done this many times before. "Here you go, sweetheart." "Thank you," Annie said. The nurse glanced at Daniel. "Miss, Mitchell will probably be out for another hour or two." "That's fine," he said. She gave a brief nod and moved on. Annie unfolded the blanket carefully and draped it across her legs. Daniel watched her do it and thought again how strangely composed she was for a 6-year-old in the middle of the night while her mother lay unconscious behind closed doors. Children were supposed to unravel in emergencies. They were supposed to ask the same question again and again. They were supposed to need constant comforting. But Annie seemed to understand that the night was already carrying enough weight, and she had chosen not to add to it. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "You did the right thing, you know." Annie turned toward him. "Coming to your house?" "Yes." She thought about it. "I didn't know if rich people answered doors." Daniel almost smiled. "Most of them probably don't. My mom says money makes some people scared of regular life." He looked at her. "She says that?" "She says if people got too much, they start protecting it more than they protect people." Daniel let the words settle. That sounded like something Laura would say. Even now, after all these years, he could hear the shape of it. She had always spoken plainly, never trying to sound smarter than she was, which only made people notice later how right she often turned out to be. He looked across the waiting room again, but what he saw for a moment was not the vending machine and muted television. It was the high school library. A cold afternoon in November, Daniel at 16, awkward and sharp in all the wrong places, sitting alone with a chemistry book he barely understood. Laura Mitchell dropping into the chair across from him without asking. "You always look like you're preparing for a trial," she had said. He had looked up then, confused. "What?" "Like the world's accusing you of something," she had replied. "It isn't." Daniel blinked and came back to the present. Annie had shifted closer to him, not enough to lean, just enough that the distance between them no longer felt formal. "What was my mom like when she was little?" she asked. Daniel let out a quiet breath. He had not expected the question, though perhaps he should have. Children gathered adults into stories the way they gathered buttons, coins, and lost crayons, small proofs that the world connected in ways they could not yet map. "She wasn't little when I knew her," he said. "But she was." He searched for the right word. "Steady." Annie waited. "She was the kind of person people trusted," he continued. "In school, there were always loud people, important people, popular people, and then there were the people everyone turned to when something really mattered. Your mom was one of those." Annie looked down at the blanket over her knees, thinking hard. "She still is," she said. The certainty in that answer landed somewhere Daniel had kept quiet for too long. "Yes," he said. "I believe that." A little after 1:40, the same doctor came back through the doors. "She's awake." Annie stood immediately. The doctor smiled at her first, then looked to Daniel. Only for a few minutes. She's weak, but alert. He led them down a bright hallway, smelling faintly of antiseptic and overheated air. The floors shone too much under the fluorescent lights. Posters about flu prevention and blood pressure screening lined the walls. Somewhere nearby, a monitor beeped in a steady rhythm. Daniel followed a step behind Annie. When they reached the room, the doctor pushed the door open gently. Laura lay propped slightly upward in the hospital bed, an IV in her arm and the pale blanket pulled up to her chest. Her face had a little more color now, though exhaustion still pulled at every feature. Her eyes moved first to Annie. "Hey, baby." Her voice was rough, little more than a dry whisper. Annie walked to the bed immediately, not rushing, not launching herself across the room, just moving with quiet relief until she could lay one hand carefully over her mother's. "I called 911, she said. "And then I went to get help." Laura closed her fingers weakly over Annie's hand. "You did exactly right." Then her eyes shifted. They landed on Daniel. For a second, there was only confusion. She was looking at a man in a dark wool coat, standing stiffly near the foot of her bed. A familiar face, altered by age, success, and years away. The lines sharper, the shoulders broader, the uncertainty better hidden. Then recognition moved slowly across her expression. "Daniel?" He stepped a little closer. "Hi, Laura. There are moments in life that do not feel dramatic while they happen. No music, no grand revelation. Just two people measuring the distance between who they were and who they have become." Laura stared at him for a long second, as if pulling him through the years one memory at a time. "Daniel Carter," she said, the name coming out with both disbelief and a trace of something lighter. "You're the one Annie found? She came to my house." Laura closed her eyes for a brief moment, as though gratitude and embarrassment had arrived at once. "Oh, Lord, you don't need to do that," Daniel said quickly. "To do what?" "Feel embarrassed." One corner of her mouth almost moved. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one fainting in your kitchen." Annie looked between them. "You know each other?" Laura opened her eyes again and looked at her daughter. "We went to high school together." Annie turned immediately back to Daniel, as if that transformed him from stranger to a category she could understand. "You were friends?" Daniel answered before Laura could. "I'd like to think so." Laura's eyes rested on him again, softer this time. "He's being polite. I was nicer to him than he thought he deserved." "That sounds about right," Daniel said. The doctor, still standing near the door, stepped in gently. "Just a few more minutes." Laura nodded faintly. She looked at Annie first. "You stayed so brave." "I went to the house with the lights," Annie said, as if continuing a conversation she'd started earlier. "He said I should go home. Then I knocked again." Laura turned her head slightly toward Daniel. He felt the look before he fully met it. "I did," he admitted. A tired smile passed over Laura's face. Not amused exactly, just knowing. "You always did need a second chance to do the right thing." Daniel gave a low, reluctant laugh. "That also sounds about right." The room fell into a gentler quiet after that. Hospital quiet. Monitors humming. Vent above the ceiling clicking softly. Laura's gaze moved between Annie and Daniel. "What time is it?" she asked. "Almost 2, Daniel said. She frowned faintly. "You should both be home." Annie didn't argue, but she did look at Daniel as if he might have a better answer. He looked back at Laura. "I can stay until they discharge you." Laura studied him. People changed. Towns changed. Years changed almost everything. But trust, once planted deeply enough, had a way of surviving in hidden roots. "Why did you?" she asked softly. Daniel knew what she meant. Why had he come? Why had he stayed? Why was he still standing there after the ambulance, after the paperwork, after the moment most people would have taken as their exit? He answered honestly, "Because Annie knocked twice." Laura looked at her daughter, then back at him. "Well," she said weakly. "She always was persistent." Annie gave a small nod. "I know." This time Daniel did smile. The doctor stepped forward again. "That's enough for now. She needs rest." Annie squeezed her mother's hand one more time, then stepped back. As Daniel followed her into the hallway, he glanced once over his shoulder. Laura was still looking at him, not as the billionaire whose name appeared in business magazines or local charity headlines, not as the man in the large house at the end of Maple Street, just Daniel. For reasons he could not quite name, that felt heavier than recognition and lighter than judgment, almost like being seen by someone who remembered the version of him he had spent years outgrowing, only to discover he had not outgrown it at all. In the hallway, Annie walked beside him in silence. At the nurse's station, a woman in blue scrubs told them Laura would likely remain overnight for fluids and observation. Someone would need to arrange clothes, medication pickup, and a ride home tomorrow. Daniel nodded. I'll handle it. The nurse barely looked up from her chart. Family? Daniel paused. Before he could answer, Annie spoke. He's the one who opened the door. The nurse glanced at him then, really looked at him, and seemed to decide that was explanation enough. Back in the waiting room, Daniel stood near the window and looked out at the dark parking lot. Ambulance lights flashed briefly at the far curb, then vanished. His own reflection hovered faintly in the glass-expensive coat. Tired eyes. The posture of a man who had learned how to manage every room except the ones that mattered. He had come tonight because it was faster to drive than to walk. He had stayed because the child had no one else. But standing there under hospital lights, Daniel began to understand something more uncomfortable. Some doors opened into emergencies. Others opened into the parts of your life you thought were finished. By the time Daniel and Annie left the hospital waiting room, the night had settled into that strange hour when even emergency lights seemed tired. It was a little after 2 in the morning. The automatic doors opened with a tired sigh, letting out a rush of cold air sharp enough to wake the skin. The parking lot stretched under white security lights, rows of cars silvered with frost. Somewhere in the distance, a truck downshifted on the highway. Otherwise, the town had gone still. Annie walked beside Daniel in silence. The hospital blanket folded neatly over her arms. She was not dragging her feet, not asking when they would go home, not doing any of the things adults expected tired children to do. She simply kept pace, watching where she stepped. Daniel unlocked the SUV and opened the passenger door for her. Hop in. She climbed into the seat and placed the folded blanket on her lap. Daniel walked around the front of the vehicle, got in, and started the engine. Warm air began pushing through the vents. For a second, he sat there with both hands on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the empty lot. He had not planned past the hospital. Emergencies did that. They forced action first and thought later. He pulled out slowly. The town looked different on the drive back. Main Street was empty now. The diner dark. The gas station glowing like a lonely island at the corner of Route 8. The grocery store sign buzzed above an empty parking lot. Christmas decorations still hung from a few lampposts, though the holiday had passed days ago. They looked tired in the cold. Daniel glanced at Annie. "Do you have anyone who can stay with you tonight?" he asked. She thought for a moment. "Miss Green next door helps sometimes. Is she home? I don't know." Daniel nodded once. "We'll check." That was the adult answer. Practical, temporary, safe. But as he turned back toward Oak Lane, he could already feel the complication waiting for him. Laura would be in the hospital overnight. Annie was 6, and the house on Oak Lane had a broken glass on the kitchen floor, a front door left unlocked, and no guarantee that the next-door neighbor would answer in the middle of the night. He tightened his grip on the wheel. "Did your mom ever tell you what to do if she had to stay at the hospital?" he asked. Annie looked out the window at the passing streetlights. She said, "Stay with someone kind." Daniel did not answer immediately. Somewhere deep in his memory, he heard Laura's teenage voice again, plain, calm, impossible to dismiss. Kindness was never weakness to her. It was responsibility with its sleeves rolled up. They turned onto Oak Lane. Laura's house sat quiet beneath the porch light. The ambulance was gone. The front yard looked exactly as it had an hour earlier, except now Daniel knew too much about what waited inside. He parked at the curb. "I'm going to check next door," he said. "Stay here for a second." Annie nodded. Daniel stepped out into the cold and walked to the neighboring house, a narrow place with a red front door and a ceramic wreath hanging crookedly beside it. He rang the bell once, then knocked. No answer. He waited, then tried again. A light came on in the front room, but no one approached the door. Daniel stood there another few seconds, then turned back toward the SUV. Through the windshield, he could see Annie sitting very straight in the passenger seat, hands folded over the blanket. He tried the house on the other side. This time, an older man opened the door 3 inches, chain lock still fastened. "Yes? Sorry to bother you," Daniel said. "I'm looking for someone who knows the Mitchell family next door. Laura Mitchell was taken to the hospital tonight." The man looked past Daniel toward the curb, then back again. I know who she is. Do you know if there's someone nearby who can stay with her daughter tonight? The man's face shifted into the polite discomfort of someone already preparing to say no. My wife's not well. We can't really take on. That's all right, Daniel said, stopping him before the apology had to work harder. I understand. He stepped away from the porch. That left the facts plain and unpleasant. A 6-year-old girl could not stay in the house alone. He could call social services, of course. The police. Some emergency after-hours placement system designed for exactly these moments. But the thought landed wrong. Too cold. Too institutional. Too easy to justify from the outside. He walked back to the SUV and got in. Annie looked at him. Miss Green didn't answer? No. She waited. Daniel stared through the windshield at Laura's house. The porch light threw a pale yellow square across the steps. Somewhere inside, the kitchen clock would still be ticking. The lunchbox still sat on the counter. The work gloves still waited beside the unopened mail. He could hear his own mind beginning its usual arguments. This is not your responsibility. You have already done enough. There are proper channels for things like this. All true. And yet there sat Laura Mitchell's daughter in the passenger seat of his car, trusting him because his lights had been on. Daniel let out a slow breath. Annie, he said, turning slightly toward her. Your mom is going to be at the hospital for several hours. Maybe until morning. I know. I don't think you should stay here by yourself tonight. I know. The matter-of-fact way she said it made him almost smile despite himself. He rubbed a hand across his jaw. I can take you back to my house until we hear from the hospital. She looked at him for a long second, not surprised, just considering. Will there be food? Daniel blinked. Yes. Okay. It was the most reasonable acceptance of an emergency arrangement he had ever heard. He started the car again. As they drove back toward Maple Street, Daniel realized how long it had been since another person had come home with him unexpectedly. Years. Certainly. Long enough that the idea of someone small and awake under his roof at this hour felt less like charity and more like a disruption to a carefully managed system. His house had been designed for order. Shoes stayed by the front entrance. Mail went in one tray. Meetings happened in glass offices downtown, not in kitchens. Children did not wander in at 2:30 in the morning asking practical questions. Yet when they pulled into the driveway and the house rose ahead of them in warm light, something about the sight had changed. It no longer looked merely expensive. It looked useful. Daniel parked and got out. This time he did not have to tell Annie where to go. She followed him up the front steps while he unlocked the door. Warmth moved over them the moment they entered. The foyer glowed softly. The old radio in the study had gone quiet, but a lamp still burned near the staircase. The house smelled faintly of coffee and cedar. Annie stopped just inside the doorway and looked around. Not with awe, not with envy. Simply with the alert attention of a child cataloging a new environment. Daniel took her blanket and hung up his coat. Okay, he said. First things first. He led her into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and frowned slightly at its contents. He was not a man who kept much comfort food on hand. Sparkling water, eggs, yogurt, leftovers from a catered lunch, expensive cheese no one had touched. He opened another cabinet. Crackers, peanut butter, bread. That'll do, he murmured. He set bread in the toaster and took down a small plate. Do you like peanut butter? Yes. Good. That makes one problem easy. Annie climbed onto a bar stool and watched him with quiet interest as he worked. Daniel spread peanut butter over the toast with more concentration than the task required. Does your house always stay this bright? Annie asked. Usually. Why? He glanced toward the hallway windows where pale gold reflected against the dark glass. I work late. That's not the real reason. Daniel looked back at her. Children, he thought, had no respect for carefully arranged evasions. He set the plate in front of her. Eat. Annie took a bite. Daniel poured her a glass of milk, then leaned against the counter with a mug of reheated coffee for himself. The real reason, he said after a moment, is that I got used to quiet houses, and lights make them feel less empty. Annie chewed thoughtfully. My mom leaves the kitchen light on when she works nights, she said. She says every house should keep one light awake. Daniel stared at her for a second. That sounded exactly like Laura. Of course it did. He looked around the kitchen again, the polished counters, the stainless steel appliances, the bowl of fruit someone refreshed twice a week whether he needed it or not. For years he had moved through these rooms without really inhabiting them. They were beautiful, organized, and efficient. But tonight, for the first time, the room felt like it had a purpose beyond impressing visitors who rarely came. Annie finished half the toast and set it down. "Where do I sleep?" "Straight to the next practical matter." Daniel nodded once. "Good question." He took her upstairs to the guest room at the end of the hall. A room decorated so neutrally it could have belonged in a hotel, cream walls, white quilt. One framed landscape print above the bed. He stopped in the doorway and frowned. Too formal, too impersonal. Annie stepped inside anyway and touched the edge of the blanket. "It's soft." Daniel exhaled quietly. "Good." He found an extra toothbrush in the linen closet and set it by the sink in the guest bathroom. Then he went downstairs, brought back a bottle of water, and placed it on the nightstand. Annie had already taken off her boots and lined them neatly by the door. "Your mom will call as soon as she can," he said. "And I'll be here if you need anything." She climbed onto the bed and pulled the covers up. "Mr. Carter?" "Yes?" She looked at him with that same calm steadiness she had shown on the porch. "You shut the door first." Daniel stood very still. "Yes," he said. "But then you opened it." The room went quiet. There are truths that sound small when spoken by children and enormous when they reach an adult heart. Daniel gave the only answer that felt honest. "Yes," he said again. "I did." Annie nodded as if that settled the matter. "Good night." "Good night, Annie." He turned off the lamp, leaving only the hallway light spilling softly through the cracked door. Downstairs, Daniel stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment. One hand braced against the counter. The house was still bright. The windows still glowed against the dark, but the light felt different now, not like insulation, not like habit, like witness. He had spent years believing a front door was mainly for keeping the world out. Tonight, he was beginning to understand it could also be the place where a life turned inward and became something better. Daniel did not sleep much that night. He told himself he stayed awake in case the hospital called. But that was only part of the truth. The larger part was harder to name. The house had changed the moment Annie's small boots crossed the front hall, and Daniel felt it everywhere now in the quieter way he closed cabinets. In the glance he kept lifting toward the staircase, in the strange awareness that another life was breathing under his roof. He sat in the study with the lamp turned low and the phone on the desk in front of him. The clock read 3:12 a.m. The financial reports on his laptop remained open, but he had not read a single line in nearly an hour. Jazz still played faintly from the old radio, trumpet and piano soft enough to blur into the hum of the furnace. Outside, the yard lay silver under the winter sky. Maple Street remained still, the kind of stillness that belonged only to wealthy neighborhoods and very late hours. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hand across his mouth. Laura Mitchell. The name moved through his mind like something both familiar and unwelcome, not because it brought pain exactly, but because it brought unfinished memory. He had spent enough years building himself into someone efficient, guarded, and difficult to surprise. He preferred facts to recollection, motion to sentiment, results to regret. But memory had never cared what he preferred. He looked through the glass doors of the study into the hall beyond. Upstairs, the guest room door stood closed, a narrow line of shadow beneath it. Annie had asked no questions after he left her there. No request for a stuffed animal. No fear of strangers. No call into the night asking if her mother would be all right. She had simply accepted the room as she had accepted everything else tonight, as the next thing that needed doing. That, more than anything, unsettled him. At 6, children were supposed to lean on adults. Annie moved through the world as if she had already learned that leaning was a luxury. Daniel stood and crossed to the window. From here, he could see the front gates and the empty road beyond them. He had once liked the house because nothing arrived uninvited. Tonight, that same privacy felt less like comfort and more like accusation. "You shut the door first." He could still hear Annie's voice saying it upstairs, not hurt, not angry, simply true. "Yes," he murmured to the dark glass. "I did." And then, he had opened it. He stayed by the window until the phone rang at 3:41. Daniel crossed the room at once and picked up on the second ring. "This is Daniel Carter." "Mr. Carter? This is Street Andrews Regional. I'm calling about Laura Mitchell." His shoulders tightened before the nurse had even finished the sentence. How is she? She's stable, resting now. Her blood pressure has improved with fluids, and the doctor expects she'll be discharged later this morning if she continues like this. Daniel exhaled. Not relief exactly. Relief had warmth to it. This felt more like the loosening of a fist he had not realized he was making. Can she take a call? Not yet. She drifted back to sleep. That's fine. There was a short pause. We also wanted to confirm that Annie is safe. Daniel looked toward the ceiling. She's here with me. Good, the nurse said, and the single word carried more gratitude than the hospital had any reason to give him. Miss Mitchell was worried about that before she fell asleep. Daniel thanked her, hung up, and stood with the phone still in his hand. Safe. It was an ordinary word, but tonight it seemed to gather weight wherever it landed. He went upstairs a few minutes later and opened the guest room door carefully. Annie had pushed the blanket down in her sleep and turned slightly onto her side. One hand rested open against the pillow. The hallway light washed softly over the bed, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. Daniel stepped in quietly and pulled the blanket back over her shoulder. She did not wake. For a second, he simply stood there, looking at the child who had crossed town alone because her mother had fallen, and the ambulance was late, and every other porch light had gone dark. Daniel left the room and closed the door halfway. He went back downstairs and stayed awake until dawn. Morning arrived slowly, as winter mornings did in small northeastern towns. The sky outside the kitchen windows turned first from black to charcoal, then to a thin, washed gray. Frost clung to the lower edges of the glass, tracing pale, fern-like patterns against the light. The furnace clicked on again. Somewhere down the street, a delivery truck rumbled past. Daniel stood in the kitchen making coffee when he heard small footsteps on the stairs. He turned. Annie came down one careful step at a time, one hand sliding along the banister. She was wearing the same oversized hoodie from the night before, the sleeves still hanging over her hands. Her hair had loosened further in sleep. Good morning, Daniel said. Morning. Her voice sounded a little rough with sleep, but otherwise she seemed exactly as composed as she had been at midnight. Did you sleep all right? Yes. Daniel poured coffee into his mug, then paused. Do you eat oatmeal? Annie considered the question seriously. Yes. Good. He had not made oatmeal for another human being in at least 10 years, possibly longer. He found a saucepan, added water, oats, a pinch of salt, and stood at the stove stirring while Annie climbed onto the same bar stool she had used the night before. The kitchen felt different in daylight, less dramatic, less protective. It showed its real proportions, then the wide marble island, the polished wood floors, the expensive appliances no one had ever learned to use with affection. Sunlight, pale and thin, rested across the counter near Annie's elbows. Daniel glanced at her. The hospital called. She looked up immediately. Your mom's doing better. Annie nodded once. Her shoulders lowered just slightly, as though a weight had shifted position even if it had not disappeared. Can we see her? Yes. Later this morning. He spooned the oatmeal into 2 bowls before realizing he had automatically made one for himself too. Annie watched as he set hers in front of her and added brown sugar from a ceramic jar near the stove. Do you want raisins? Yes. He added raisins. They ate in a quiet that did not feel awkward. The sort of quiet older people understood, the kind that came not from lack of words, but from the absence of any need to force them. Daniel had spent years in rooms where silence meant competition, discomfort, or judgment. This felt different, simpler, shared. Annie looked around the kitchen between bites. Did you grow up in a house like this? Daniel gave a quiet huff that almost passed for a laugh. No. Was it smaller? Much. How much? He leaned back against the counter with his coffee. Small enough that if someone sneezed in the front room, the whole house said, "Bless you." That earned him the faintest hint of amusement on Annie's face. My mom says small houses make close people. That sounds like your mom. Annie stirred her oatmeal slowly. Were you rich when you were little? No. That answer came easier than he expected. I grew up in a house a lot more like yours than this one. She looked at him carefully, as if measuring the distance between the truth and the polished world around him. Then how did you get this house? Daniel took a sip of coffee, buying himself a second. I built a company, then I sold it. That's it? He blinked. Well, no. There was a lot of work in the middle. Annie nodded as if she had suspected as much. You knew my mom before the house? Yes. In school? Yes. What was she like? The question came again, but it landed differently in the morning light. Daniel looked toward the window. He remembered Laura at 17 with the sleeves of a denim jacket rolled to her elbows, standing beside a cafeteria table, while two boys laughed at the shoes Daniel wore because they came from a clearance rack. He remembered her looking at them, then at him, and saying in that plain, unimpressed voice, "If cheap shoes bother you, try buying some character." The boys had shut up. Daniel had pretended it did not matter. Laura had sat down beside him anyway. She was brave, he said at last. Annie's spoon paused. She didn't always make a big show of it. She just did the right thing when something needed doing. Annie seemed to think that over. Then she nodded, satisfied. That sounds right. Daniel looked down at his coffee. Funny, he thought. How success could carry a man all over the country, into boardrooms and private terminals and magazine covers, only for truth to arrive back in his kitchen through a child eating oatmeal with raisins. After breakfast, Daniel called the hospital again and confirmed Laura could have visitors later that morning. Then he made a few practical arrangements. He had one of his assistants, a woman named Marlene who had worked with him long enough not to be startled by unusual requests, contact the office, and clear his schedule. He asked another staff member to have a few child-sized clothes delivered to the house quietly and without questions. By 8:30, a small paper bag sat by the foyer with leggings, socks, a sweater, and a toothbrush still in its package. Annie looked at the bag, then at him. "For me? For now," Daniel said. "You might want clean clothes before we go to the hospital." She accepted that with the same plain grace she accepted everything else. No fuss, no performance, no false gratitude exaggerated to make adults comfortable. Just, "Thank you, Mr. Carter." He nodded once. By 9:15 they were back in the SUV, the heater humming softly, the town awake at last around them. School buses moved through intersections. Men in work jackets carried coffee out of gas stations. A woman in a church coat scraped frost from her windshield with determined strokes. Daniel drove toward the hospital with Annie beside him, both of them looking forward. Some nights altered a life in obvious ways with wreckage, headlines, or loss. Others did it more quietly. A knock, a refusal, a second chance, and then morning, arriving whether a man was ready for it or not. By the time Daniel turned into the hospital parking lot, the town had fully awakened. Morning traffic moved in short, practical lines along the main road. Pickup trucks rolled past with ladders strapped to their roofs. A school bus stopped at the corner just long enough to take on 3 children in oversized coats. The winter sun had finally risen, though it gave little warmth. Its pale light lay over the streets like a promise, still deciding whether it meant anything. Inside the SUV, the heater hummed softly. Annie sat in the passenger seat wearing the new sweater Daniel had given her that morning. A deep blue one, simple enough not to draw attention. Her boots were the same, though now their laces were properly tied. She held the seatbelt with one hand as if it anchored more than just her body. Daniel parked near the entrance and turned off the engine. "Ready?" he asked. Annie nodded once. They walked through the automatic doors together. The hospital looked different in daylight. Less mysterious, less forgiving. Fluorescent lights flattened everything into function. The waiting room that had seemed suspended in midnight worry now showed its ordinary wear. Scuffed floors, faded magazines, plastic plants trying their best to look alive. The nurse at the desk recognized Annie immediately. "Well, there she is," she said, smiling over her glasses. Then she looked at Daniel. "And you came back." Daniel wasn't sure what answer that deserved. "We're here to see Laura Mitchell." The nurse checked the screen in front of her. "Room 214. She's been asking for the little one." Annie was already looking toward the hallway. The elevator ride to the second floor was quiet. Daniel stood with his hands in his coat pockets, listening to the soft mechanical hum as the car rose. Annie watched the floor numbers light one by one above the door. At room 214, Daniel stepped aside and let Annie enter first. Laura was awake. She sat propped up in bed, her dark hair brushed back now, though exhaustion still rested across her face like a shadow that had not finished leaving. The IV remained in her arm. Her color had improved, but not by much. She looked like a woman held together by will and not enough sleep. The moment she saw Annie, Something in her expression eased. "There's my girl." Annie crossed the room quickly then, placing one hand against the blanket near her mother's arm. "I had oatmeal," she said. Laura smiled, the kind of smile only mothers give children when the details are far less important than the fact that they are there to tell them. "Did you? With raisins?" "Well," Laura said, glancing briefly at Daniel now standing near the door. "That sounds fancier than what I usually manage." Daniel gave the smallest lift of one shoulder. "It was instant oatmeal. Let's not oversell it." Laura let out a weak laugh, then winced slightly at the effort. Even that brief sound seemed to change the room. Laughter in a hospital did not erase anything, but it reminded everyone present that the patient remained a person and not just a condition. Daniel stepped a little farther inside. "How are you feeling?" Laura looked at him in that direct way he remembered from school, the expression of someone too tired for performance and too honest for evasion. "Like my body filed a formal complaint." "That sounds about right," he said. The doctor arrived a few minutes later, carrying a tablet and the unhurried expression of a man who had delivered the same explanation many times. He introduced himself again for Daniel's sake, then reviewed Laura's condition: severe exhaustion, dehydration, low blood pressure, and what I'd call prolonged physical overextension, he said. "No sign of stroke, seizure, or cardiac event, which is the good news." Laura folded her hands lightly over the blanket. "And the bad news?" The doctor looked at her over the edge of the tablet. "The bad news is that bodies don't usually collapse without a history leading up to it. You've been running on empty for too long." Laura said nothing. The doctor continued in the calm, plain-spoken way older physicians sometimes used when they knew charm was less useful than respect. "You need rest. Real rest. Not a long nap followed by another double shift. Fluids, meals, follow-up blood work, and at least several days away from physical labor." Laura's mouth pressed into a line. "I can't afford several days." The doctor did not argue the point, because people like him understood that reality better than younger doctors sometimes did. "What you can't afford," he said quietly, "is another collapse." He left them with discharge instructions to be finalized by noon if Laura's blood pressure remained stable. The room fell quiet after he went. Laura stared at the blanket over her lap, as if the folds in it were somehow easier to face than the truth sitting in the room around her. Daniel had seen that look before. In men after layoffs, in women after funerals, in himself, once or twice, though never where anyone could watch for long. Finally, Laura said, "Annie, honey, would you go sit by the window for a minute?" Annie looked from her mother to Daniel, then obeyed without question. When the child had settled into the chair by the window, Laura turned back to Daniel. "I need to say thank you before anything else." "You don't." "Yes, I do." Her voice remained soft but steady. "You drove her here. You stayed. You brought her home with you." She paused. "And you came back." Daniel looked at the foot of the bed instead of directly at her. "She came to my house. That doesn't mean most people would have done what you did." He almost said, "Most people wouldn't have shut the door first either." But Annie was in the room, and Laura looked too tired for confessions that changed nothing. Instead, he said, "She handled the night better than most adults would." A shadow of pride moved through Laura's expression. "She's had practice being brave when I wish she didn't need it." Daniel glanced toward the window. Annie sat quietly, looking out over the parking lot, giving the adults privacy with a grace that should not have been necessary at her age. Laura followed his gaze. "I hate that she had to go looking for help. She found it. On the second try," Laura said. There it was. Not accusation, not even reproach, just truth, spoken plainly the way she had always spoken it. Daniel met her eyes then. "Yes." Laura studied him for a moment longer, then gave the faintest nod as if to say the admission mattered more than any excuse could have. "I remember that about you," she said. "What? You usually got where you needed to go." Her lips curved slightly. "You just didn't like anybody noticing the first turn was wrong." Daniel let out a quiet breath that might have become a laugh under easier circumstances. "That sounds like something a 17-year-old version of you would say in a hallway. I was wiser at 17 than I am now." "I doubt that." Laura leaned back against the pillow, and the humor softened from her face. "Daniel, I really can't miss too much work." He didn't answer immediately. The old instinct in him, the businessman's instinct, wanted details, numbers, a clean summary of facts before he committed to anything. But another instinct had taken root during the night. Older, perhaps. Less efficient, more human. "How many jobs are you working?" he asked. Laura hesitated just long enough for him to know the answer would be bad. 2. Sometimes 3 shifts if the weekend cleaning work comes through. Daniel looked at her. "The warehouse?" She nodded. "Night shift loading manifests and repacking returns." "And the other?" "Cleaning offices 3 evenings a week, sometimes more." She gave a tired shrug. "It adds up slowly." He looked around the room. The hospital bed, the thin tray table, the paper cup of water untouched beside it. "Does it?" The question wasn't cruel, but it was sharp enough to land. Laura did not flinch from it. "No," she said. "Not really, but it keeps the lights on." Usually, outside the window, morning light fell across the parking lot in pale stripes. Nurses crossed between buildings with takeaway coffees in hand. A maintenance worker pushed a cart past a bank of shrubs trimmed too precisely to be natural. Daniel thought of his own house then. The endless light, the stocked kitchen, the rooms no one used. He thought of the kitchen on Oak Lane with its cracked tile, broken glass, work gloves, and overdue bills stacked by the refrigerator. Success doesn't mean much, he thought, if all it does is separate you from the people who once taught you what mattered. Annie turned from the window then and came back to the bed. "Are we going home today?" Laura touched her daughter's hand. "I think so." Annie nodded, accepting the answer. Then she looked at Daniel. "Will you drive us?" The question entered the room so naturally that none of them spoke for a second. Daniel answered first. "Yes," he said. "I will." Laura looked at him. And this time, what passed between them held more than gratitude. It held recognition, too, not of fame or money or the polished version of Daniel Carter the town knew from newspaper profiles, but of a boy she had once defended, and a man who, despite years of distance, still recognized a knock when it mattered. There are old connections that disappear with time, and there are others that wait quietly beneath the surface until one long night, one hospital room, one child's voice brings them back into the light. Daniel drove them home just after noon. The discharge process had taken longer than anyone wanted. Hospitals moved at 2 speeds, urgent and slow, and once Laura Mitchell had been deemed no longer urgent, the morning became a procession of forms, instructions, prescription slips, and careful reminders delivered by people in scrubs who had seen too many patients promise rest with no real intention of taking it. Now Laura sat in the front passenger seat of Daniel's SUV, one hand resting lightly near the seatbelt, the other holding a white pharmacy bag in her lap. Annie sat in the back, unusually quiet, as if the last 12 hours had finally begun settling into her bones. The town outside moved through an ordinary weekday rhythm. A man in a reflective vest carried boxes into the hardware store. Teenagers in varsity jackets crossed the street outside the diner, laughing too loudly for winter air. A church sign on the corner announced a food drive and next Saturday's pancake breakfast. Nothing in the streets suggested that one woman had collapsed in her kitchen the night before, or that a 6-year-old had walked alone through the dark because the adults around her had stayed behind closed doors. That, Daniel thought, was one of the strangest things about suffering. The world rarely paused for it. "How's the dizziness?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Better," Laura said. "Not gone. Better. That's something." "It is." Her voice had more strength in it than it had that morning, but fatigue still lay under every word like a second tone. Daniel could hear it easily now. Years in business had taught him how to detect weakness in negotiations, uncertainty in pitch meetings, false confidence in public statements. But human exhaustion had its own sound. He heard it in single mothers, factory men, widowers, teachers near retirement, people who kept going because stopping was not built into the budget. Laura turned the pharmacy bag once in her hands. "I really do appreciate this," she said. Daniel glanced at her, then back to the road. "You've said that. I know. I'm saying it again." A pause settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just careful. Then Laura added, "Annie told me you let her stay in your guest room." "I had a guest room. Most men in your position would have had their assistant find a charity hotline and considered it compassion." "That sounds like a criticism wrapped as a compliment." Laura gave the faintest smile. "You always could hear those." Daniel almost smiled too. In the back seat, Annie spoke up. The bed was soft. Laura turned slightly. "Was it? And he makes oatmeal." Daniel said. Let's not make me sound more domestic than I am. You put raisins in it, Annie continued, as if presenting evidence in a hearing. Laura looked at Daniel again, and something gentler entered her expression. Well, I stand corrected. He drove the next few blocks in silence, one hand loose on the wheel. Oak Lane appeared ahead, narrower and less polished than Maple Street, its houses closer together, its yards smaller, its sidewalks cracked from too many winters. The difference between neighborhoods in a town like this was never just money. It was how long people expected things to last. Roofs, cars, marriages, knees, hope. Daniel pulled up in front of Laura's house and put the SUV in park. Take it slow getting out, he said. I'm not 90. No, he said. But you did fall unconscious in your kitchen. Laura gave him a look that belonged very clearly to the version of her who had once corrected teachers without raising her voice. I remember why you were hard to impress. I'm not trying to impress you. Good, she said. That would be exhausting for both of us. Annie was already unbuckling in the back. Daniel got out first and came around to open Laura's door before she could protest. She accepted the gesture with the restrained dignity of a woman too tired to waste energy resisting practical help. The house looked smaller in daylight than it had the night before. The front steps needed repainting. One shutter leaned slightly away from the siding. The porch light, still on though noon had come and gone, made the place look like it had forgotten how to stop waiting. Daniel walked ahead and opened the front door. Inside, the air carried the stale quiet of a home abruptly left. The kitchen still bore signs of the collapse. The chair knocked slightly off angle. The dish towel Daniel had used, the neat pile of swept glass near the baseboard. Morning light came through the thin curtains and showed everything plainly. Laura stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and stared. This is embarrassing. No, Daniel said. It's a kitchen. She looked at him, then down at the broken glass. It's a kitchen that tells on me. Annie moved to her mother's side. Daniel set the pharmacy bag on the counter and crouched near the floor. Do you have a dustpan? Under the sink. He found it, gathered the remaining shards, and carried them to the trash while Laura lowered herself slowly into one of the kitchen chairs. She sat carefully, like someone negotiating with her own body. Annie stood near the table, watching both adults. Daniel ran water in the sink and washed his hands. Then he turned and leaned against the counter. What did the doctor say exactly? Laura sighed, as if she had hoped the walls of the house might silence that subject. He said rest, fluids, no lifting, follow-up this week, and that I can't go back to work tomorrow. Can't or shouldn't, she gave him a level look. Daniel, for people like me, those are often the same conversation. The words stayed in the room. People like me. It was not bitterness. It was fact. Laura Mitchell did not have the luxury of pretending class in America was only a theory discussed by people with tenure and time. Her rent was due whether her blood pressure cooperated or not. Her daughter needed food whether exhaustion had put her in the emergency room or not. Daniel looked around the kitchen. The refrigerator had school pictures attached with mismatched magnets. A handwritten note on the counter listed shifts and grocery reminders. Peanut butter, milk, laundry soap, Annie's field trip form. Ordinary life, he thought, could humble a person faster than any scandal ever would. Annie climbed onto the chair beside her mother. Can you stay home now? She asked. Laura tucked a loose strand of hair behind Annie's ear. For a little while, yes, that's good. Children did not romanticize recovery. To Annie, her mother being home was the point. Adult panic, hospital systems, financial pressure, those belonged to another language. Laura reached for the pharmacy bag, then stopped halfway as if even that motion cost more than it should have. Daniel pushed off the counter. Let me see the paperwork. She looked up at him. You don't have to. I know. He took the discharge papers and prescription slip, reading quickly. Fluids, iron, rest, follow-up appointment in 4 days. Then he noticed the unopened envelopes near the fruit bowl again. Utilities, credit card company, final notice in a red-stamped corner. He set the hospital forms down with more care than he felt. How bad is it? Laura was quiet for a moment. It was one thing to collapse in front of an old classmate, another to let him see the shape of the math that waited behind the collapse. I was catching up, she said at last. Then Annie needed new boots. Then the heater went out for 2 days last month. Then I picked up more shifts and thought I could balance it out. And instead you ended up in the ER. Yes. Daniel looked toward the window over the sink. The yard was small, boxed by a wire fence at the back. A child's red ball sat half hidden under the porch steps. Across the way, someone had hung wind chimes that moved without music in the cold. What about Annie's father? He asked. Laura's answer came gently, without drama. He died when she was 2. Daniel nodded once. I'm sorry. I know. That was another thing age taught decent people. Not every sorry needed elaboration. Annie traced one finger over a knot in the wooden table. My mom says we're okay. Laura touched the child's shoulder. We are okay. Daniel believed she meant it. And perhaps that was what moved him most. Laura did not mistake hardship for collapse. She still insisted on dignity in the middle of strain. She still chose her words the way older Americans often did. When life had taken enough from them, they did not hand over self-respect unless the price became unavoidable. Daniel looked at the counter again, then at Laura. What if you actually rested? A faint line appeared between her brows. What does that mean? It means you follow the doctor's orders, not the version working people translate them into. The real version. Food, sleep, no warehouse, no office cleaning, no pretending your body didn't just send up a flare. Laura let out a breath that held almost no humor. And with what money? There it was at last. The center of the thing. Not the hospital. Not the fall. Not even the night itself. Money was never just money in a house like this. It was medicine and rent and groceries and whether a woman stood up too fast because she had to keep moving. Daniel heard his own voice before he had fully arranged the sentence. I'll take care of the immediate bills. The kitchen went still. Even Annie looked up. Laura stared at him as if she had not heard correctly. Daniel, I'm not offering pity. That's good, she said quietly. Because I don't take it. I know. He held her gaze. I'm offering help. She looked away first, not in shame, but in caution. People who had needed help too often learned to inspect it before touching it. Free things could come with hooks. Kindness could turn into ledger entries. Gratitude could be treated like a debt that matured with interest. I can pay you back, she said. Daniel almost answered automatically. Take your time, no rush. We'll work something out. But he stopped himself. Laura would hear condescension in those phrases even if he did not mean it. Instead, he said, We'll decide that later. She looked back at him. It was not yes, but it was not no. Annie, sensing something important had happened in a language built for adults, reached for her mother's hand. Daniel picked up the prescription slip. I'm going to get these filled and bring back groceries before evening. Laura straightened a little in the chair. Daniel, that's already too much. No, he said. Too much was your daughter walking alone at midnight. The sentence landed harder than he intended. Laura lowered her eyes for a moment. When she looked up again, she seemed older and somehow steadier at the same time. Then let me say this plain, she said. Thank you. Not because I'm helpless. Not because you owe me from high school. Thank you because you chose to show up. Daniel nodded once. For older people, gratitude spoken plainly carried more weight than any dramatic display. It came from the part of life where pride and humility had finally stopped fighting long enough to shake hands. He headed for the door, then paused and looked back. Annie sat beside her mother in the small kitchen where a night of fear had turned into afternoon light. Laura looked tired, proud, and very near the edge of whatever strength she had left. The house itself still needed fixing in a dozen ordinary ways, but it no longer looked abandoned to its own struggle. Maybe that was what help really did, Daniel thought. Not rescue, not erase, just keep a person from facing the next hour alone. Daniel did not realize how many things a house could need until he began buying them for someone else. The pharmacy came first. He drove from Oak Lane to Main Street with Laura's prescription slip folded in his coat pocket, and a list forming in his head almost faster than he could arrange it. Medication, electrolyte drinks, soup, bread, fruit, something Annie would actually eat, something Laura could warm up without standing long at the stove, then maybe a space heater for the kitchen, because the air in that house had carried the thin bite of a heating system doing only half its job. At the pharmacy counter, the woman in blue scrubs recognized him from the newspaper, then made a visible effort not to act as though she had. Daniel appreciated that more than he would have at 30. "These will take about 20 minutes, she said. "That's fine." He waited near a display of over-the-counter cold medicine and travel-sized toiletries, hands in his coat pockets, listening to the soft beeping of scanners and the low conversation of people collecting ordinary necessities. A man in a feed store jacket argued gently with a toddler over a packet of gummy vitamins. An older woman asked the cashier where the arthritis wraps had been moved. Life kept on in all its small errands and aches, regardless of who had fainted in a kitchen the night before. Daniel thought of Laura sitting at the table on Oak Lane, shoulders squared even in exhaustion. "Thank you because you chose to show up." It was a simple sentence. But simple sentences were often the ones that lasted. He picked up the prescription bag when it was ready and drove to the grocery store. The place smelled of coffee from the in-store cafe and the faint sweetness of overripe bananas. Mid-afternoon shoppers moved with the steady pace of people who knew exactly what their budgets could tolerate. Daniel took a cart and stood for a second under the fluorescent lights, strangely uncertain. He was very good at large decisions. Acquisitions, staffing, restructures, contracts worth millions. Those things never confused him. But standing in aisle 3 deciding whether a 6-year-old might prefer apple slices or clementines felt oddly consequential. He started with practical things: chicken noodle soup, saltine crackers, whole grain bread, milk, eggs, oatmeal, peanut butter, tea. Then he added things that felt less clinical. A rotisserie chicken still warm under its plastic lid, fresh blueberries, string cheese, a box of macaroni Annie could manage if Laura needed to rest, a small jar of strawberry jam. He paused in the cereal aisle, looked at 2 different boxes, and chose the one with less sugar. At the end of the aisle, a woman about Laura's age struggled to lift a large bag of dog food into her cart while balancing a toddler on one hip. Daniel stepped forward on reflex. "Here." "Oh, thank you." He lifted the bag easily. She gave him a grateful nod, then did a brief double take, the kind people did when they knew a face from somewhere but couldn't place it immediately. Daniel moved on before recognition could become conversation. By the time he reached checkout, the cart looked less like a charitable gesture and more like what it actually was, the contents of a home trying to steady itself. He added one more thing before leaving. Near the register sat a rack of children's coloring books and crayons. Cheap, bright, easy to overlook. Daniel picked up a small set without thinking too hard about why. Annie already had crayons at home, but children, like houses, sometimes needed visible proof that someone had thought ahead for them. At the hardware store, he bought a space heater, light bulbs, a new porch bulb, heavy-duty batteries, and a basic toolkit after remembering the loose shutter and sagging front step at Oak Lane. He told himself those were practical purchases. They were, but practicality, he was beginning to understand, was often just kindness wearing work boots. When he pulled back up to Laura's house, the afternoon sun had shifted low enough to throw long shadows across the yard. A pickup truck sat parked across the street, and an older woman in a quilted coat stood on the neighboring porch pretending not to watch him unload bags. Daniel carried the first armful inside and found Annie at the kitchen table with a coloring sheet in front of her. Laura sat nearby with a mug of tea, still pale but more upright than before. Annie's face brightened, not theatrically, just honestly. "You came back." Daniel set the bags on the counter. "I said I would." Laura looked at the groceries, then at the pharmacy bag in his hand, then at the space heater under his other arm. "Daniel." It was the kind of one-word sentence that could mean gratitude, warning, resistance, and disbelief all at once. He set the prescription bag on the table. "Doctor's orders," he said. "And before you argue, at least wait until I've carried everything in." Laura leaned back in her chair with the expression of a woman who knew she was losing ground and hated that some part of her was relieved. "I wasn't going to argue." "Yes, you were, probably." That earned the faintest smile from him. He made 3 more trips to the car. Groceries filled the counter. The space heater went near the kitchen wall. He changed the porch bulb in less than a minute and tightened the loose latch on the front door while Annie stood nearby observing with grave attention. "You know how to fix things?" she asked. "I know how to hire people who do," Daniel said. Then, after adjusting the latch a final time, he added, "But I can manage a screwdriver." "That's good," Annie said. "Mom says every grown man should know one thing with tools." From the table, Laura said. "I said every grown person should know one thing with tools." Annie looked back at Daniel. That too. The house warmed quickly once the new heater began humming. Daniel unpacked groceries with the efficiency of someone who had spent most of his adult life building systems. Soup in the cabinet, fruit in a bowl, milk in the refrigerator, prescriptions beside the tea where Laura would see them. He found himself irritated by what was missing. Too little food, too much strain, too much evidence of a woman stretching one paycheck across 3 lives' worth of obligation. When he reached for the stack of unopened envelopes to clear a space on the counter, Laura's voice stopped him. "Don't." Daniel looked up. Her tone was not sharp, just firm. He set the envelopes back down. "Sorry." She nodded once. "I know you mean well." The room quieted a little after that. Annie went back to coloring. Laura sipped tea. Daniel stood by the sink, looking out through the thin curtain over the backyard. The late winter grass was flattened and pale. A child's plastic shovel leaned against the fence. Beyond it, bare branches moved against a hard white sky. Finally, Laura said, "You remember senior year?" He turned. The question had come so gently he almost missed its weight. "Some of it." She looked down into her mug. "You used to stay late in the computer lab because you didn't want to go home." Daniel said nothing at first. Annie kept coloring, humming faintly under her breath. "That obvious?" he asked. "To me? Yes." He leaned one shoulder against the sink. "You never said anything." Laura gave a tired half-smile. "I figured if I acted like I noticed, you'd stop talking to me." "That's probably true." "I know." Age had softened many things, Daniel thought, but not Laura's instinct for plain truth. He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her. "Why did you stay?" he asked. "In town?" He nodded. Laura looked toward Annie before answering. "My father got sick right after graduation. Then my mother. Then life sort of made decisions faster than I did." She lifted one shoulder slightly. "That happens more than people admit." Daniel looked around the kitchen again. He had spent years assuming people stayed in towns like this because they lacked ambition. It was the kind of assumption success whispered to a man if he let it. But sitting across from Laura now, he felt the poverty of that idea. People didn't only stay because they were afraid to leave. Sometimes they stayed because someone had to. Annie slid her coloring page across the table toward Daniel. It showed a square house with yellow windows and a black sky above it. Stick figures stood on the porch, one tall, one medium, one very small. "That's your house," she said. Daniel looked at the page. The windows were bright gold. "Is that me?" "The tall one." "And the little one?" "Me." He glanced at the third figure. "And your mom?" "Yes." Laura looked at the drawing and then away, as if emotion had brushed too near her and she preferred not to make a public event of it. Daniel handed the page back carefully. "It's a good house." Annie considered that. "It was better because you opened the door." The room went still. There it was again, that child's way of setting down truth without decoration. Laura's fingers tightened slightly around her mug. Daniel looked toward the window, then back at Annie. "Not the first time, but the second time," Annie said. "Yes," he answered quietly. "The second time." Outside, the wind moved against the siding with a sound like a hand brushing over old wood. Inside, the small kitchen held its warmth. Tea steamed. Crayons rolled softly across the table. A woman recovering from collapse rested in the chair she should have been able to sit in long before her body forced the issue. Daniel had spent half his life building walls high enough to look like achievement. Now, in a modest kitchen on Oak Lane, he was beginning to see the greater dignity in being useful. The next morning began with frost on the inside corners of Laura's kitchen window and the smell of coffee Daniel had not planned to make. He arrived just after 7:30 carrying a cardboard tray with 3 cups, though only 2 held coffee. The third was hot chocolate, because somewhere between the grocery store and his own kitchen the day before, he had begun noticing the shape of Annie's mornings too. When he knocked, the porch light was finally off. That small detail pleased him more than it should have. Annie opened the door. She was dressed for school in a clean sweater, her hair brushed and tied back more neatly than the night before. She stepped aside at once. "Mom's awake," she said. "And she says if you brought more things, she's going to protest." Daniel handed her the hot chocolate. "Then I'll make sure this isn't technically a delivery." Annie considered that with the seriousness of a child evaluating adult strategy. "That's smart." He stepped inside. The kitchen felt warmer now. The new heater hummed softly near the wall, and the groceries he'd stocked the day before had already changed the room. A loaf of bread sat open on the counter. A bowl with 2 bananas and 3 apples gave the place color. Laura sat at the table wrapped in a faded blue cardigan, one hand around a mug of tea, looking tired but far more present than she had in the hospital. "You're early," she said. "You sound disappointed." "I sound suspicious." "That too." He set the coffee on the table and took the seat across from her without asking, the way one only did in a house that had begun, somehow, to make room for him. Laura nodded toward the cups. "You really don't have to keep doing this." "I know. You say that every time." "Because it remains true every time." Annie climbed into her chair and carefully unwrapped the lid from the hot chocolate. She looked from one adult to the other and said nothing. Daniel had started to suspect she understood more about tone than either of them meant to reveal. Laura took a cautious sip of coffee, and Daniel watched some of the strain leave her face on instinct alone. "That good?" he asked. She looked down at the cup, then back at him. "It's coffee I didn't have to make after sleeping more than 4 hours. So yes, it's good." That answer belonged to a particular kind of American adulthood, he thought. The kind that measured comfort not by luxury but by the absence of one more task. He glanced at Annie. "You ready for school?" Annie nodded. "Miss Harper said if I'm late, I still have to do spelling." "That sounds like a personal rule," Daniel said. "It is." Laura almost smiled. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I made a call this morning." Laura's face changed immediately. "Not fear. Guard." "What kind of call?" "The kind that doesn't change anything you've already agreed to," he said. "I asked someone in town about office work. Daytime, seated, better pay than cleaning contracts, regular hours." Laura stared at him. "Daniel," I said, asked, not arranged. Annie took a sip of hot chocolate, apparently satisfied that this was not an emergency. Laura set down her mug carefully. "You don't get to redesign my life because I passed out once." "No," he said calmly, "but I can mention an opening when I hear about one." She held his gaze. This was where many people went wrong with help. They mistook urgency for authority. They assumed generosity gave them editing rights over another person's dignity. Daniel knew that, or was at least trying to. "I'm not trying to manage you," he said. "I'm trying to widen the hallway a little. That's all." The tension in Laura's shoulders eased a fraction. "That line would have worked on me in high school too," she said. "It probably would have taken me 3 tries back then." 4. He accepted that with a small nod. Annie slid off her chair. "I need my library book." "It's in your backpack," Laura said. "No, that's the red one. I need the dinosaur one." She disappeared down the hallway before either adult could respond. Daniel looked at Laura. "How are you really?" She leaned back in her chair, tired enough to answer honestly. "Still weak. Still embarrassed. Still trying to calculate how long I can afford to obey my doctor." He nodded. "And how long is that? If the electric bill takes its usual amount and nothing else breaks this month?" "Maybe 5 days." Daniel glanced toward the stack of mail on the counter. He had respected her boundary yesterday and left the envelopes untouched. But boundaries did not erase what they represented. Laura followed his gaze. "I know what those are," I assumed. She looked down at her hands, then out the window for a moment. The morning light lay thin across the backyard fence, catching on frost that had not yet melted in the shade. "When my husband died," she said quietly, "I learned something nobody tells you when you're young." Daniel said nothing. "They tell you grief is emotional. It is. But they don't tell you how administrative it is." Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. "Forms, bills, school papers, insurance calls, broken appliances, groceries. You don't just miss a person. You inherit 100 daily responsibilities, with nobody left to split them." Daniel looked at her more carefully then. He had known, in broad terms, that Annie's father was gone. But broad terms were often where comfortable people kept hard truths so they could feel informed without being pierced by detail. Laura went on, her voice even. "At first, everybody helps. Casseroles, church ladies, neighbors saying call if you need anything. Then time passes, and one by one they go back to their own lives." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "Which is fair. Everybody's carrying something. Daniel thought of his own life after loss, though of a different kind, and the well-meaning people who had offered him privacy as if it were the same as care. He had accepted it, because privacy suited him, but privacy also had a way of hardening around a man until he called it independence. Annie returned with 2 books and her backpack half-zipped. "Found them. Good," Laura said. Daniel stood. "I can drive her." Laura began to object on reflex. He saw it in the first lift of her posture. Then she stopped. "You don't have meetings?" "I moved them." "Because of one school drop-off?" "Because I'm 40, Laura." At this age, if a man can't rearrange a meeting, he's not successful. He's trapped. That got a real smile out of her. Quick and tired, but genuine. Annie looked between them. "So, yes?" Laura nodded. "Yes, but straight there. No donuts." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That sounds oddly specific." "She knows why." Annie looked innocent in the way only children and practiced defense attorneys ever truly could. The drive to the elementary school took less than 10 minutes. Children crossed the sidewalk in bright jackets and backpacks too large for their shoulders. A crossing guard in a reflective vest blew a whistle at a parent who ignored the drop-off lane. Teachers stood near the entrance, greeting students by name with the focused cheerfulness of people who had not yet run out of Tuesday. Daniel pulled up near the curb. Annie unbuckled, then paused. "Will you be here later?" He looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Yes." She nodded, satisfied, and reached for the door. Then she looked back once more. "You really do open the door different now." Daniel held still. Children, he thought again, never wasted a good truth. When she was gone, he sat in the school lane a second longer than necessary before pulling away. He didn't drive back to Maple Street immediately. Instead, he went downtown to an older brick building above the hardware store where a small accounting office occupied the second floor. The owner, a widow named Jean Holloway, had handled taxes for half the town for nearly 30 years and knew more private financial history than most pastors. Daniel had met her through a charity board. She was competent, discreet, and allergic to nonsense. When he stepped into her office, she looked up over bifocals and said, "Mr. Carter, you're either in trouble or trying to solve some." "Second one." Jean set down her pen. "That's usually the more expensive kind." He almost smiled. "I'm looking for work for someone. Smart, organized, reliable, needs seated hours and decent pay." Jean studied him. "Temporary? Maybe not. Desperate? Proud?" Jean nodded as if that explained far more. "Those are often the people worth hiring," she said. Then, after a beat, "Who is she to you?" Daniel thought of the hospital room, the small kitchen, the girl who had knocked twice, the woman he had once known before. Life narrowed and widened them in different directions. He answered with the truth available to him. "An unfinished part of my life that showed back up at my door." Jean leaned back in her chair. "Well, that sounds inconvenient." "It is." "And?" Daniel glanced out the office window at Main Street below, where people moved along the sidewalk, carrying dry cleaning, coffee, hardware bags, prescriptions, ordinary lives in ordinary weather. "And I think I'd like to do right by it." Jean was quiet for a moment. Then she opened a desk drawer, took out a yellow notepad, and wrote down 3 names. "Start here," she said. "And if she's as good as you say, send her to me after she's had some rest." Daniel took the paper. Outside, the church bells rang 10 o'clock from somewhere beyond the square. A man could spend years believing life changed through ambition, strategy, and force of will. But sometimes it changed because a little girl had looked up at a closed door and knocked again. By late afternoon, the winter light had turned the town the color of old paper. Daniel parked outside Laura's house with Jean Holloway's folded note in his coat pocket and a bag of takeout balanced carefully in one hand. He had chosen food that could pass as thoughtful without feeling extravagant: chicken pot pie from the diner on Main, green beans, mashed potatoes, a side of cornbread Annie would probably like more than she admitted, and pecan pie because older towns and older people both understood the quiet dignity of dessert after a difficult week. When he knocked, Annie opened the door before he had to do it a second time. "You came back," she said again, as though the statement itself remained worth confirming. "I keep doing that," Daniel replied. She stepped aside to let him in. The house smelled warmer now. Not just physically warmer, though the heater still hummed near the wall, but lived in. The sharp edge of emergency had faded. In its place was something more fragile and more demanding. Recovery. There were dishes in the drying rack, a cardigan draped over the back of a chair, Annie's library books stacked near the sofa. Ordinary life had resumed, but gently, as if the house itself was testing whether it could trust the day. Laura sat at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her. The sight of it irritated Daniel immediately. He set the takeout on the counter and looked at the notebook, then at her. "What are you doing?" Laura capped her pen, which told him all he needed to know. "Nothing. That's a lie. It's budgeting," she corrected. "That's different." Daniel pulled out the chair opposite hers and sat down. "Did the doctor clear you for budgeting?" "Don't be impossible. You say that like I haven't earned it." Annie climbed onto her chair and began peeking into the takeout bag. "What is it? Dinner? From the diner?" "Yes, that's good," Annie said. "Their mashed potatoes taste like church dinners." Laura closed the notebook halfway, but not before Daniel saw enough numbers and circled due dates to understand exactly what she had been doing, trying to restore order by force of arithmetic. "Laura." She met his eyes. He heard the argument she was prepared to make before she spoke it. Rest doesn't stop bills. Gratitude doesn't suspend rent. Dignity has always had to share a kitchen with math. "I'm not overdoing it," she said. "I'm sitting down. That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." For a second, neither of them moved. Then Annie said, "If y'all are gonna talk like old people, can I at least have cornbread first?" Laura pressed her lips together, fighting back a smile. Daniel gave up and let one show. "Yes," he said. "You can have cornbread first." They unpacked dinner together. Daniel plated the food because Laura was still moving, like someone whose body had not fully decided to forgive her. Annie carried napkins with solemn importance. Soon, the three of them sat around the small kitchen table with the kind of meal that made a room feel less temporary. For a while, they just ate. Older people knew the value of that too. Not every silence needed to be corrected. Some were better honored. Annie was the first to speak. "Miss Harper asked why I was absent this morning." "What'd you tell her?" Laura asked. "That you were in the hospital, but now you're not." Laura nodded. "That's enough." And then she said I was very brave. Laura looked down at her plate for a moment before answering. Well, she was right. Annie accepted that as a matter settled. Daniel cut into the pot pie and listened to the soft sounds of forks, plates, the heater, the old refrigerator humming. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, and yet it carried more weight than some boardrooms he had sat in with millions of dollars at stake. Maybe because this was real in a way polished places often were not. After dinner, Annie carried her plate to the sink and announced she would be in the living room with her books, unless somebody needed me for a serious grown-up reason. Then she disappeared, leaving the adults with the sort of privacy children learned to grant when life had required them to grow observant too soon. Daniel waited until he heard the soft turn of a page from the next room. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed Jean Holloway's folded note on the table. Laura looked at it but didn't touch it. "What's that?" "A few names, offices in town, seated work, bookkeeping support, scheduling, intake, that sort of thing. Decent pay, regular hours." She leaned back slightly. "You move quickly." "I've been accused of that. I'm sure by people who say it with less admiration than they pretend." "That too." Laura still did not reach for the paper. Daniel watched her carefully. She was not refusing because she lacked interest. She was refusing because acceptance changed things. It introduced dependence, possibility, obligation, three things pride preferred to keep behind separate doors. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. "I know, but you should look." Laura lowered her eyes to the note, then finally picked it up. Her fingers unfolded it with more caution than the paper deserved. Jean Holloway, Karen Bell Accounting, Street, Matthews Community Office. She read each name quietly. "Jean Holloway," she said. "My mother used her for taxes. She said she remembers your family." Laura gave a small exhale. "That town never forgets anything." "No," Daniel said. "It just waits until your life circles back around." She looked up at him then, and something softened in her expression. That sounded older than 40. "I've had a long week." She almost smiled again. From the living room came Annie's voice. "Mom?" "Yes, baby? Can Mr. Carter read this book?" Daniel turned slightly. "Which book?" "The dinosaur one." "But you have to do the voices right." Laura shook her head faintly. "You can still say no." Daniel stood. Apparently I can't. He found Annie cross-legged on the living room rug with the library book open in her lap. She handed it up to him without ceremony. Daniel sat in the armchair nearby, a chair he had never sat in before, and began reading about a very dramatic triceratops with more commitment than any sane man should have given the assignment. Annie corrected two of his voices. Laura, from the kitchen doorway, watched the scene with one hand around a mug of tea. By the third page, Daniel became aware of something he had not felt in a very long time. Ease. Not the ease of luxury, not the ease of being obeyed, admired, or left alone. Something older, simpler. A room where no one expected him to perform success. A child who only cared whether the triceratops sounded properly offended. A woman in the doorway who knew versions of him that had existed long before headlines and board appointments. When the book ended, Annie nodded in approval. You did better than I expected. Daniel handed the book back. That sounds suspiciously like praise from your mother. It is. Laura laughed softly then, and this time the sound did not catch in her throat. Later, after Annie had gone to brush her teeth and change into pajamas, Daniel stood by the front door, putting on his coat. Laura came down the hallway slowly, stopping a few feet from him. The house had gone quiet again, in the best way, lamplight low, dishes drying, a child settling in for the night. Beyond the front window, evening had deepened across Oak Lane. A porch light glowed at the neighbors. Wind moved faintly through the bare branches overhead. Laura held Jean's folded note in one hand. I'll call her tomorrow, she said. Daniel nodded once. Good. A pause followed. Then Laura said, You know this can't become a habit. What can't? You rescuing us every time life gets mean. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm not trying to rescue you. No? No. He settled his hand on the doorknob. I'm trying to make sure you get the chance to stand back up properly. Laura absorbed that in silence. For older people, the difference mattered. Rescue could humiliate, but a steadying hand, offered at the right moment, could preserve something essential. Her voice, when she spoke again, had gone quieter. In high school, people thought you were going to leave this town and never look back. I did leave. That's not the same thing. Daniel glanced toward the living room where Annie's book now rested crookedly on the cushion. No, he said. I guess it's not. Laura looked at him in a way that asked nothing and understood too much. Good night, Daniel. Good night, Laura. He stepped out onto the porch. The cold met him at once, clean and sharp. He walked to his SUV, then stopped with his hand on the door and looked back at the house. The porch light glowed above the steps. Through the curtains, he could see the softened gold of the living room lamp. A small house. A tired house. A house that had nearly lost too much because one woman had kept going past the point where she should have had help. But tonight it looked steadier. Not fixed. Steadier. Daniel got into the SUV and sat for a moment before starting the engine. There are times in life when a man begins to understand that success was never supposed to end with him. That money, influence, and distance only become wisdom if they eventually circle back into usefulness. He had spent years building a life no one could interrupt. Now, for the first time in a long time, interruption felt a lot like purpose. The town noticed before anyone said anything out loud. Not because small towns were magical. They weren't. They were observant. There was a difference. By the second week after Laura came home from the hospital, people had begun adjusting their understanding of Oak Lane without admitting it directly. The mail carrier stayed an extra minute at the box once and asked Laura how she was feeling. Miss Green from next door finally appeared with a casserole and an apology for having slept through the night Annie had gone looking for help. The woman at the pharmacy stopped saying, "Take care now," in the automatic way people often did, and said it like she meant it. And at the elementary school, when Daniel Carter's black SUV appeared a second time in the pickup line, the crossing guard looked once, looked again, and decided there was a story there worth saving for later. Spring had not arrived yet, but winter had loosened enough for people to believe in it. Patches of old snow still clung to the edges of parking lots and shaded lawns, yet the air had changed. It carried less threat. On some afternoons, the sunlight stayed longer on porch rails and chain-link fences. The town still wore its winter coat, but the collar had opened. Laura had rested the full 5 days. That alone felt remarkable. She hated it on principle for the first 2 days, tolerated it on the third, and by the fourth had admitted quietly, and only once, that she had not realized how deeply tired she had been. Jean Holloway met with her on the 6th day and hired her for part-time office work the following Monday. It was not glamorous. Intake paperwork, filing, scheduling, phone messages, but it came with steady hours, a chair, and the rare dignity of labor that did not ask a woman to injure herself just to prove gratitude for a paycheck. Daniel told himself that should have been enough. He had helped with the gap, arranged what he could, opened a door, then stepped back. That was the sensible version of the story. But life was rarely shaped by the version that sounded most sensible in a man's own head. On a clear Thursday evening, Daniel stood in his kitchen on Maple Street, looking at the lights reflected in the windows. He had always left them on. The front hall lamp, the porch lanterns, the kitchen pendant lights, the study lamp by the glass doors. For years he had told himself it was habit, work, preference. The practical choices of a man who disliked dark corners and empty rooms. Now he knew better. Light was never neutral. It either welcomed or warned, invited or excluded, testified or hid. Daniel poured himself coffee he did not really want and stood by the counter, listening to the quiet of the house. It no longer felt the same as it had before Annie's knock. The rooms were still large, the silence still expensive, but something in the house had been corrected, and the correction made the old emptiness impossible not to notice. A knock sounded at the front door. He looked up at once, not because he expected trouble, because now he heard doors differently. When he opened it, Annie stood on the porch in a puffy blue coat, a knit hat sliding slightly over one eyebrow. Laura stood just behind her with one hand on the child's shoulder and a foil-covered pie dish balanced in the other. Daniel looked from one to the other. "What's this?" "Pecan pie," Annie said. Laura lifted the dish slightly. "A thank you that you are not allowed to refuse." Daniel stepped aside. "That sounds alarmingly specific." "It is," Laura said, walking in. "Older women in this town have been enforcing dessert diplomacy since before either of us were born." Annie went straight to the kitchen as if she had been there 100 times instead of only a few. Laura followed more slowly, still carrying herself with some carefulness but no longer with that deep invisible drag of someone running on fumes. Daniel took plates from a cabinet. "I assume there are rules attached to this pie." "Yes," Laura said. "You eat it. You do not call it unnecessary, and you do not act like helping people is a debt they're required to pay off in neat emotional installments." Daniel paused with a plate in his hand and looked at her. "That sounds less like pie and more like a legal statement." Laura smiled. "Jean says I'm getting good at paperwork." They sat at the kitchen island while Annie explained, in great detail, why the crossing guard at school had a whistle with too much attitude. Laura had worked 3 full days at Jean's office and already brought home stories about overdue tax folders, church volunteers who missed appointment times by exactly 17 minutes every year, and the strange calm that came from work not trying to break her back. Daniel listened more than he spoke. That, too, had changed. There are seasons in a person's life when speaking feels like strength. Then, if life is kind and difficult in equal measure, there comes another season when listening begins to feel more like honor. After pie, Annie wandered into the study and returned holding the old library dinosaur book Daniel had accidentally left in the back seat days ago. "You still owe this voice one more try," she said, flipping to a marked page. Laura leaned against the doorway with her arms folded, watching as Daniel read 3 pages in a voice that made the Triceratops sound mildly insulted by civilization. Annie laughed. Not loudly, not wildly, just the clear, easy laugh of a child who had reached the far side of fear and found ordinary life still waiting there. When the reading was done and the plates were empty, Laura stepped out onto the front porch with Daniel, while Annie stood inside examining the framed photographs in the hall. The evening air carried the faint, wet scent of thawing ground. Across Maple Street, porch lights glowed in steady rows. Somewhere farther down, a dog barked once, then settled. Laura looked out over the street. This house makes more sense now. Daniel leaned one shoulder against the porch post. Because of the pie, because it sounds used. He let that sit. Inside, Annie's voice drifted through the foyer. "Is this you when you were little?" "No," Daniel called back. "That's me, looking uncomfortable at a fundraiser." Laura laughed softly, then quiet settled between them. Not empty, just full enough to matter. "You know," Laura said after a moment. For years, I told Annie that if anything ever went wrong, she should go where there was light. Daniel turned slightly. Why? Laura looked down at her hands, then out again at the street. Because darkness lies, she said. It makes people believe they're alone. Light doesn't solve everything, but it tells the truth about where to knock. He thought about the first night then. The porch, the refusal, the second knock. He had spent a long time believing that strength meant self-containment, that a safe house was one no one disrupted, that the successful thing to do was protect what he had built from unnecessary demands. But the older he got, the more he saw the poverty in that idea. A house was not noble because it was secure. A life was not meaningful because it was untouched. The best things in this country, the things older Americans still recognized when the noise died down, were rarely built out of comfort alone. They were built out of usefulness, decency, second chances, and the stubborn insistence that another person's trouble was not an inconvenience to be managed from a distance. Laura looked at him. Annie still talks about the first time you shut the door. I know. She also talks about the second time you opened it. He nodded once. I know that too. Laura studied him with the same plain honesty she had carried since high school. People don't become who they are in one moment, she said. But sometimes, one moment shows them who they've been trying not to be. Daniel looked out at the porch lights along Maple Street. A month ago, they had meant nothing to him beyond aesthetics and habit. Now he saw them as choices. Some people used light to display a house. Some used it to soften loneliness. And some, whether they meant to or not, left it burning long enough for a lost child to find the right door. Inside, Annie appeared at the threshold. Mom, can we go now? In a minute. Annie nodded and waited with surprising patience. Laura turned to Daniel one last time. You helped more than my bills, she said. You know that, right? He did not answer immediately, because older people knew some truths deserved a little room before they were spoken. Finally, he said, So did you. Laura seemed to understand exactly what he meant. She reached out then, not dramatically, not romantically, not with anything that tried to name the future before it arrived, and rested her hand briefly over his. It was a gesture of trust, of recognition, of two people no longer pretending that one hard night had left them unchanged. When she and Annie finally drove away, Daniel remained on the porch. The sky above Maple Street deepened into evening blue. One by one, lights came on in neighboring houses. A lamp in a second-floor window, a porch lantern across the street, a kitchen glow 2 homes down where someone was probably washing dishes and listening to the local news. Daniel looked back through his own open front door. Warm light filled the entryway and stretched along the hall. For years, he had kept the lights on because empty rooms felt less empty that way. Now he understood something better. Light was not something a man used to keep darkness out. It was something he kept burning so that when life arrived cold, frightened, and needing mercy, it would know exactly where to knock. This story reminds us that kindness often begins with a simple choice: to open the door instead of turning away. In life, many people carry silent burdens, exhaustion, grief, financial struggle, or loneliness, and sometimes all they need is one person willing to notice and care. Daniel's greatest change did not come from his wealth, but from his willingness to respond when a child asked for help. The story teaches that true strength is not measured by success or independence, but by compassion, responsibility, and the courage to stand beside others when they are vulnerable. A single act of empathy can change not only someone else's life, but also the direction of our own. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.